Did you know that the crisis of 1873, also known as the Long Depression, was one of the most impactful events in economic history, yet it's rarely given the attention it deserves? At a time of blind faith in progress, the collapse of the railroad and real estate markets not only shook the global economy, but also revealed the fragility of a system driven by greed and speculation. What most people don't realize is that the mistakes of that era are still being repeated today in surprising ways. If you've ever wondered how crises shape the future and what lessons we can learn to avoid repeating the past, you're in the right place. Get ready to uncover how this crisis changed the course of economic history and how those lessons can still help you better understand the world today. The origins of the 1873 crisis. The crisis of 1873, also known as the Long Depression, originated in a period of intense speculation and expansion, especially in the railroad and real estate sectors. In the years leading up to the collapse, both the U.S. and Europe experienced a phase of great economic optimism, where many believed that progress was inevitable and limitless. Railroad construction, for example, was seen as a surefire investment. It was a time when extraordinary technological advances seemed to guarantee wealth and success for all. However, this unchecked optimism led to the creation of financial bubbles, fueled by easy credit and reckless loans. The curious thing is that few noticed the signs that the system was on the brink of collapse. Pressure on the financial system grew silently but relentlessly until the crisis struck devastatingly, leaving a trail of panic and uncertainty. Investors, lured by the promise of quick profits, often ignored the risks. The speculative nature of investments in railroads and land created a scenario of artificial prosperity, where the real value of these assets was inflated beyond their foundations. History repeats itself. What seemed like an incredible innovation, capable of transforming society, became the trigger for one of the largest economic crises of the era. However, this phenomenon wasn't limited to the railroad market, as other sectors also began to feel the impact of unchecked speculation. The curiosity about how the economy could destabilize so quickly, even amidst so much innovation, gripped the keenest minds of that time. Contrary to what many expected, the crisis wasn't a localized event. It crossed borders and spread rapidly to Europe. Economic ties between continents were stronger than ever, and this interdependence facilitated the transmission of the financial shock. In Europe, the same optimism had fueled a bubble in similar sectors. Governments and large financial institutions were dangerously exposed to these sectors, which further increased the fragility of the global economic system. The historical lesson here is clear. The nature of the global economy is far more interconnected and influential than it seems at first glance. Furthermore, the effects of the crisis soon began to appear in other sectors, such as industry and agriculture, revealing the true scope of the problem. With prices collapsing, many businesses went bankrupt and unemployment skyrocketed. People began losing their homes and properties, which only exacerbated the situation. The fear of a prolonged recession was in the air, and confidence in financial institutions, once so solid, began to crumble. This is the extraordinary power of panic. It can destroy in days what took decades to build. What makes this crisis even more fascinating is the way it changed the financial behavior of people and businesses. Before, risk was seen as something natural and even encouraged, but after the crisis of 1873, investors became much more cautious. Confidence, the foundation of any financial system, had been broken, and this would have consequences for many years. The phenomenon of slow recovery, where fear and uncertainty dominate for long periods, began to take shape. This moment was a true lesson for economists and investors, a reminder that even the most innovative sectors can be affected by the volatile nature of markets. It's curious to realize how the solutions adopted to try to contain the crisis, in many cases, ended up prolonging its effects. Many countries opted to adopt protectionist policies and tried to isolate their economies from global impact, which only worsened the situation. The lack of international cooperation was a key factor in the long duration of the Depression. The consequences of the 1873 crisis and the lessons learned from it shaped how economists and governments came to see the importance of a more integrated and balanced global economy. The crisis of 1873 teaches us that innovation, no matter how extraordinary, needs a solid foundation of sustainability and responsibility. While progress is important, when driven by greed and speculation, it becomes fragile and vulnerable. The economic system is like nature. It works in cycles and can be unpredictable. To avoid future crises, it is crucial that the lessons of the past are not forgotten. The next chapter of this story is equally fascinating. The collapse of financial markets and its devastating impact on populations around the world. The collapse of financial markets. The collapse of financial markets in 1873 began with a real shock. The bankruptcy of J. Cook & Company in the United States. This bank, which had become the largest financier of American railroads, saw its profits plummet as railroad investments began to lose value. The extraordinary growth in the railroad sector had been driven by unchecked optimism, but reality finally caught up and the bubble burst. The bankruptcy of J. Cook was not an isolated event, but the first domino to fall in a long chain of financial collapses that would devastate global markets. The effect was immediate. Investors panicked, selling their stocks en masse, and the stock market plummeted. In Europe, the situation was no different. Major banks, such as Austria's Kreditanstalt, were also deeply involved in loans for infrastructure and railroads, and their collapse triggered a wave of bank failures across the continent. What began as a financing problem for railroads quickly turned into a widespread crisis of confidence. Companies in all sectors dependent on bank credit began to fail, creating a downward spiral. The curious thing about this phase is the speed with which the crisis spread, showing how fragile and interconnected the financial system already was at that time. Even without the modern technology we know today, small investors were also severely affected. Many had put their life savings into railroad stocks, attracted by the promise of quick and substantial returns. When the crisis hit, they lost everything. Imagine the feeling of seeing your entire financial future collapse overnight, without warning. This phenomenon created a wave of impoverishment that affected millions of families worldwide, not just the big investors. The extraordinary impact of the crisis on everyday lives is a reminder of how financial markets, often seen as distant from people's daily lives, can deeply affect the social fabric. The prolonged depression that followed the collapse of markets forced many governments to intervene, but the policies adopted were not always effective. In the United States, for example, the government tried to increase the money supply by issuing greenbacks, paper money not backed by gold, but this policy was met with skepticism by the markets. Meanwhile, in Europe, many countries adopted protectionist policies, imposing barriers to international trade. These measures, aimed at protecting local economies, ended up worsening the crisis, making economic recovery more difficult. This is one of the great mysteries of economic history. The solutions that seem intuitive are not always the most effective. Another curious phenomenon was the way the crisis affected confidence in technological innovations. It was believed that the advancement of railroads, for example, was a sign of inevitable progress. However, with the collapse of this sector, many people began to look at new technologies and innovations with suspicion. The financial crisis sowed a seed of doubt about the true value of innovations when they are not accompanied by economic sustainability. This change in mentality affected the pace of industrial development in various regions, slowing the extraordinary momentum that had characterized the Industrial Revolution. Over the following years, financial markets continued to struggle to recover. The panic had created a deep distrust of banking institutions and high-risk investments. Many investors preferred to keep their money in tangible assets, such as land and gold, rather than trusting the financial system. The 1873 crisis, therefore, was not only an economic crisis, but also a crisis of confidence that marked a generation of investors and entrepreneurs. History shows us that once lost, trust in the system takes a long time to restore. This prolonged distrust and the slow recovery of the financial sector would lead to a series of challenges that would stretch over decades. The next step in this fascinating story leads us to the deep impact the crisis had on industry and global trade, drastically changing production and distribution patterns. Ready to learn more about how this depression affected the industrial world? The impact on industry and global trade. With the financial collapse triggered by the 1873 crisis, the impact on industry was devastating and long-lasting. Factories, which depended on capital to expand their operations and finance new projects, saw their access to credit dry up almost overnight. What once seemed like a period of extraordinary industrial growth was abruptly interrupted. Sectors like steel, which had been booming due to railroad demand, were among the hardest hit. Without financing, many industrial projects were canceled, and factories began to close their doors. Unemployment rose dramatically, and production levels fell to historic lows. The phenomenon of such an abrupt industrial halt left a deep mark on the global economy. The crisis also affected international trade, which had been growing rapidly in the years leading up to the Depression. With falling domestic demand, many countries resorted to protectionist policies to try to shield their domestic industries from foreign competition. Tariff after tariff, governments tried to isolate their economies from global impacts, but this strategy brought unintended side effects. By closing their markets to international trade, these nations stifled the flow of goods and capital, worsening the situation. The interconnected nature of global trade, once a driving force for growth, now seemed like a trap. This restrictive movement in global trade would be felt for decades, delaying economic recovery. Moreover, the impact on maritime trade was significant. Ports that had once been filled with ships transporting goods between continents were now empty. The decline in global trade also hit nations dependent on the export of raw materials, like Brazil and Argentina, whose economies suffered from falling prices of products like coffee and meat. Without European and American demand, these nations faced their own economic crises. A practical example of this effect was the drastic decline in U.S. cotton exports to Europe, which had been vital to Europe's textile industry before the crisis. The consequences of this reduction in trade showed how economic phenomena in one region could dramatically affect others. One of the most curious aspects of this phase was the change in the behavior of industries and governments. Many industries began to invest in technologies that could reduce dependence on external capital, seeking to increase production efficiency. Innovation, therefore, didn't completely stop, but it was redirected toward the pursuit of survival. The development of new production processes, such as the Bessemer steel process and the use of electricity in industry, began to gain prominence during this period. Although the crisis had interrupted large-scale investment flows, it also spurred a race for more innovative and cost-effective solutions. However, the impact on the working class was immense. Millions of people lost their jobs as factories and industries closed their doors. Economic insecurity led to a series of protests and uprisings in various parts of the world, such as worker revolts in Paris and strikes in U.S. factories. The extraordinary growth of the labor movement was a direct consequence of the crisis, as workers began to organize in search of better working conditions and protection from market instabilities. These labor movements would eventually shape the social and labor policies of the next century, deeply influencing history. Finally, the transformations in global trade forever altered the way nations would deal with future crises. The lessons learned during the Long Depression showed the importance of a more balanced trade policy and more robust capital reserves. The cyclical nature of the global economy became evident, and many governments began to realize that more coordinated interventions would be necessary to avoid future prolonged depressions. The extraordinary learning that emerged from this crisis impacted future generations of political and business leaders. The 1873 crisis may have shaken confidence in economic progress, but it also sowed the seeds for a new era of innovation and adaptation. Now, let's explore how the crisis affected workers and society more broadly, leading to a series of social and political changes. Ready to find out more? The impact on workers and society. The impact of the 1873 crisis on workers was profound and devastating. With the mass closure of factories and industries, millions of workers were thrown into unemployment. At that time, the concept of unemployment insurance didn't exist in most of the world, which meant that losing a job often led families into extreme poverty. The extraordinary increase in urban misery was a direct consequence of this depression. Workers who had previously benefited from the industrial boom and who believed they were building a secure future suddenly found themselves without any means of livelihood. This phenomenon generated a wave of protests and social tensions that began to spread across Europe and the United States. Strikes became a common phenomenon, with workers demanding better working conditions and fairer wages. In the U.S., for example, there was a series of railroad strikes that paralyzed parts of the country. The curious thing is that while the crisis had weakened the economy, it also strengthened the labor movement. For the first time, unions began to organize more broadly, seeking to protect workers' rights against what many saw as rampant exploitation. These movements would be a crucial factor in the social and economic transformations that would come in the following decades. The Long Depression sowed the seeds of a struggle that, years later, would result in significant advances in labor laws and social protection. In cities, desperation led to the rise of crime and social problems. Entire families were evicted from their homes due to their inability to pay rent. Misery was visible on the streets of major metropolises: Paris, London, New York. These cities, once symbols of progress and innovation, were now marked by scenes of hunger and despair. Living conditions in urban areas deteriorated rapidly. This was an extraordinary phenomenon in terms of its psychological and social impact. The promise of a better life that the Industrial Revolution had sold to so many now seemed like a cruel illusion for the working masses. The economic collapse also had a direct effect on confidence in political institutions. Many governments were seen as incapable of dealing with the crisis or protecting the population. In the U.S., for example, the government was widely criticized for how it handled the Depression. The issuance of greenbacks, paper money not backed by gold, was viewed by many as an ineffective measure that only deepened the crisis. In Europe, revolutionary movements began to gain momentum. In France, the Paris Commune, which had been crushed a few years earlier, seemed like a more attractive idea to those who believed that the capitalist system offered no solutions to social problems. This phenomenon of political and social discontent would continue to grow in the coming years. The crisis also spurred a wave of mass migration, especially from European countries to the Americas. Thousands of people, without job prospects or sustenance in their homelands, sought new opportunities in other continents. The U.S., Canada, and Argentina were some of the most popular destinations. However, the reality that migrants found upon arriving in these new countries often wasn't as promising as they expected. Economic difficulties continued to be a constant, but the curiosity for new opportunities and the hope for a better future kept fueling the migration flow. This migratory phenomenon helped shape the social and cultural development of several countries in the Americas. Another important aspect was the impact of the crisis on family and social structures. In many parts of the world, men were traditionally the breadwinners, and their inability to support their families during the crisis led to a series of social problems. Economic despair often translated into tensions within families, with many men turning to alcohol or other forms of escapism. The role of women also began to change, with more women entering the workforce, often in precarious conditions, to try to support their families. This was a historic moment of social transformation that laid the groundwork for future struggles for gender equality and labor rights. The 1873 crisis, therefore, not only shook the economic foundations of nations, but also profoundly transformed society. The lessons learned from this depression would be remembered in the following decades, especially as the labor movement and demands for social justice continued to grow. But the challenges were far from over. The next step in this story leads us to the economic recovery efforts and the financial innovations that emerged in response to the crisis. Ready to dive into this part of history? The economic recovery efforts and financial innovations. After the financial collapse of 1873, governments and financial institutions began searching for solutions to pull their economies out of the Depression. However, recovery efforts were slow and often ineffective, especially because the prolonged nature of the crisis challenged traditional strategies. In the United States, the government tried to expand the money supply by issuing greenbacks, paper money not backed by gold. The curious thing here is that instead of stimulating the economy as expected, this policy generated even more distrust, both among investors and the general public. Many feared that unbacked currency would quickly lose value, which only deepened the crisis of confidence in the financial system. In Europe, various nations opted to adopt protectionist policies to protect their domestic industries from foreign competition. Tariff upon tariff. Governments tried to isolate their economies from global impacts, but this strategy had unintended side effects. By closing their markets to international trade, these nations stifled the flow of goods and capital, worsening the situation. The extraordinary failure of these protectionist policies was a bitter lesson. In times of global crisis, economic isolation rarely offers a sustainable way out. The interconnected nature of economies was already too strong for protectionism to work without triggering a boomerang effect. Despite these setbacks, there were also important advances in the financial field. A notable example was the emergence of new financial instruments and more cautious credit policies. Banks and investors became more selective in their lending, requiring more robust guarantees to avoid another wave of bankruptcies. The extraordinary prudence that developed during this period would shape banking practices in the years to come. There were also new concepts of financial regulation, with governments and institutions seeking ways to ensure greater market stability, such as the creation of central banks with more power to influence monetary policy and contain future crises. One of the most interesting phenomena was the rise of trust companies in the United States. These companies began acting as financial intermediaries, providing a safer way for investors to apply their money in a variety of ventures. This allowed for better risk diversification and helped restore confidence in the system. Although the economic environment was still uncertain, these innovations brought a sense of renewal to the financial market. The innovative nature of these companies showed that even in times of crisis, human ingenuity can rise, turning challenges into opportunities. At the same time, nations began experimenting with fiscal policies to stimulate growth. One such innovation was the use of public investments in infrastructure, such as railways and canals, to generate jobs and spur economic development. Despite the railroad sector being one of the culprits behind the crisis, it also offered one of the few viable solutions for recovery. In the United States, the government encouraged the construction of new railroad lines, particularly in the West, as a way to create jobs and stimulate the economy. In Europe, urban modernization projects, such as the rebuilding of Paris, also helped revitalize the economy, albeit gradually. The response to the crisis also varied across social classes. While the financial and business elites sought ways to protect their assets, the working class began organizing more intensely, demanding better working conditions and social protection policies. This movement would culminate, years later, in the adoption of important reforms, such as the creation of unemployment insurance and labor regulations. The extraordinary power of popular mobilizations proved to be a driving force for change, and the 1873 crisis can be seen as a catalyst for these transformations. By pushing for change, society sought an economic recovery that was fairer and more inclusive. These recovery attempts show how the 1873 crisis forced the world to rethink its economic and financial practices. Innovation was born out of necessity, and many of the measures adopted during that time laid the groundwork for the economic development of the 20th century. However, the Depression was far from over, and its effects continued to be felt for decades. The next part of this story leads us to explore the long-term consequences of this crisis and how it profoundly transformed the global economy. Ready to learn more about how this depression influenced the world in the decades that followed? The long-term consequences of the 1873 crisis. The long-term consequences of the 1873 crisis deeply shaped the global economy in the following decades. The Long Depression, as it came to be known, lasted nearly 20 years, leaving a trail of transformations across various sectors. One of the most notable impacts was the increase in widespread distrust of the financial system. After the collapse of major banks and institutions, many investors became much more cautious in their investments. This prudence was an extraordinary phenomenon because it limited the speed of economic recovery, as capital flowed much more slowly into productive sectors. The nature of the relationship between risk and investment had changed forever, and the reckless optimism that characterized the years before the crisis was replaced by prolonged caution. This distrust wasn't limited to the financial sector. The crisis also led to a reevaluation of industrial development models. Before the Depression, economies were in a frenzied race for innovation, without much concern for sustainability. After the crisis, however, industries began to look for ways to protect themselves from future instabilities. Efficiency and automation began to gain prominence as means to minimize costs and risks. Interestingly, the Industrial Revolution that had been the engine of progress was now adjusting to the new reality of more measured growth. The lesson many entrepreneurs learned was clear. Innovation is important, but it needs to be balanced by intelligent resource and risk management. Politically, the 1873 crisis was a watershed moment. Popular movements, such as labor unions, gained significant strength after the Depression. Society, marked by mass unemployment and growing poverty, began to demand fairer social and labor reforms. The phenomenon of labor mobilization was extraordinary because many of the rights we now consider basic, such as the 8-hour workday and the minimum wage, began to be discussed and implemented as a result of popular pressure during that time. In Europe, the rise of socialist parties and revolutionary movements was a direct response to the hardships faced by the masses during the Long Depression. Additionally, the economic protectionism that emerged in response to the crisis continued to influence international policy for many years. In an attempt to protect their industries, many countries adopted harsh tariff policies that ultimately limited global trade and hindered a faster economic recovery. This protectionism would be one of the factors that led to increased economic tensions between nations, planting the seeds for future conflicts. The lack of international economic cooperation at the time showed how nations, in trying to protect themselves, often worsened global problems. This is one of the great ironies of human nature. In the attempt to isolate themselves from external risks, nations sank deeper into the crisis. The crisis also had a significant impact on public finances. Many governments, in their attempts to save their economies, became deeply indebted. This public debt would become a burden for future generations, limiting the ability to invest in infrastructure and other sectors. In Britain, for example, the government was forced to adopt an extremely conservative fiscal policy, which restricted economic growth for several years. The extraordinary weight of public debt led many nations to reconsider their fiscal policies, seeking ways to balance budgets without compromising economic development. This dilemma between austerity and growth would become a constant theme in economic debates in the following decades. Finally, the lessons of the 1873 crisis also influence how nations would deal with future crises. The need for better regulation of financial markets, the importance of social policies that protect the most vulnerable, and the interdependence between global economies became central concepts in discussions about the economy in the 20th century. The crisis proved that the collapse of a single sector, such as railroads, could trigger a chain reaction, affecting even those who initially seemed distant from the problem. The extraordinary complexity of the global economy became clear, and governments began to understand that they needed to be more prepared to face crises in a coordinated and efficient manner. The 1873 crisis, therefore, was not just an isolated event, but a turning point in world economic history. Its consequences would echo for many years, shaping economic and social development in profound ways. But the story doesn't end here. The next part takes us to explore the critical role financial institutions played in recovery efforts and how they became responsible for ensuring system stability. Ready to dive into this next chapter of history? The role of financial institutions in recovery and crisis prevention. With the collapse of markets and the devastating impact of the 1873 crisis, the role of financial institutions underwent a profound transformation. Before the crisis, banks operated with little regulation, and faith in an ever-growing economy seemed to guarantee that investments would be safe. However, the extraordinary collapse of the railroad and real estate sectors, both of which involved high-risk loans and rampant speculation, revealed just how vulnerable the global financial system was. After the crisis, governments and investors began to see banks as crucial not only for economic growth, but also for economic protection. From this point on, financial institutions assumed a central responsibility for both recovery and the prevention of future crises. In the United States, the government took steps to reorganize the banking system. The creation of stricter regulations on loans and credit flow control were some of the initial responses to the crisis. This shift was accompanied by the growing influence of the concept of central banks, which emerged as an innovative solution to monitor and control the money supply in the market. The curious thing is that although the creation of central banks was seen by some as excessive government intervention, many economists and politicians came to realize that financial stability depended on firmer regulation. The extraordinary importance of a central institution capable of acting as a guardian of currency and markets became solidified as one of the main lessons of the crisis. In Europe, central banks also began to play a more active role in the economy. The Bank of England, for example, which had existed for centuries, came to be seen as a key institution for preventing financial collapses. Its function as a lender of last resort, the ability to provide liquidity in times of crisis, became an essential tool for preventing bank panics from spreading. The ability of central banks to intervene directly in markets and control credit supplies started to be viewed as a crucial stabilizing factor. This phenomenon of greater financial control was a direct response to the bankruptcies and economic disasters that the 1873 crisis had triggered. Additionally, financial innovation began to expand with the introduction of new credit instruments and guarantees. Banks began to require more guarantees from borrowers, and credit became more selective. This caution helped to contain new speculative bubbles, at least temporarily, but also restricted capital flows to areas of innovation and growth. Interestingly, this more conservative approach prevented the kind of explosive economic expansion that had characterized the pre-crisis years, but it offered greater security to investors and the general public. It was a trade-off between rapid growth and long-term stability, and this trade-off would shape financial behavior in the years to come. Confidence in financial institutions, however, was not restored overnight. There was a growing curiosity among the public about how banks operated and about their actual ability to protect people's money. This skepticism forced many financial institutions to become more transparent in their operations, disclosing their lending practices and adopting new accounting standards. This move toward transparency was an important innovation because it allowed financial markets to operate on a more solid foundation of mutual trust. History shows us that trust, once shaken, requires significant time and effort to rebuild, and the role of banks in this rebuilding was vital. On the other hand, financial protectionism gained strength, with many governments implementing policies to restrict foreign speculation and protect national banks. Nations realized that the interconnectedness of global markets was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it provided growth opportunities, but on the other, it could transmit crises from one country to another with extraordinary speed. The 1873 crisis was a perfect example of this, with the collapse of a U.S. bank affecting all of Europe within weeks. This new understanding led many countries to create stricter regulations for the international movement of capital, limiting the impact of external crises on their local economies. Finally, the 1873 crisis taught the world an important lesson about the central role of financial institutions in the modern economy. Banks and credit institutions were no longer seen merely as growth facilitators, but as guardians of economic stability. Their ability to withstand shocks, regulate credit, and maintain public confidence became crucial to the functioning of the global economy. In the following years, the banking reforms that emerged after the crisis helped shape how national economies would handle future crises, ensuring that banks were part of the solution, not the cause of the problem. But the story doesn't end here. Financial institutions also began to play a fundamental role on the international stage, and it's interesting to see how this global interconnectedness shaped the next great chapter in world economics. Ready to explore how the 1873 crisis influenced international economic relations? The influence of the 1873 crisis on international economic relations. The 1873 crisis not only shook national economies, but also had deep consequences for international economic relations. Before the crisis, global trade was expanding with a steady flow of goods, capital, and people between continents. Economic globalization was in full swing, driven by innovations in transportation, such as steamships and railroads, which connected distant markets. However, the financial collapse and the long depression that followed changed the nature of these relationships. The extraordinary impact of the crisis made it clear that global economic interdependence could be both a source of prosperity and a fast track for the contagion of crises. One of the most significant effects was the rise of protectionism. As economies faced difficulties, many countries began imposing tariffs and trade barriers to protect their domestic industries. This was particularly evident in Europe, where powers like Germany, France, and the United Kingdom adopted harsh protectionist measures. The curious thing is that while these policies were seen as a way to stimulate domestic economies, they ended up stifling international trade. The volume of trade between nations dropped drastically, and trade tensions began to rise. This phenomenon would be a precursor to the economic and diplomatic conflicts that would emerge in the following decades. In the United States, the situation was no different. The government adopted higher tariffs to protect domestic industry from foreign competition, especially in manufacturing and agriculture. This created tensions with its European trading partners, who were also trying to protect their economies. The extraordinary consequence of this protectionism was that it triggered a series of retaliatory trade actions, with nations raising tariffs against each other. This cycle of rising tariffs further limited global trade, which was already weakened by the effects of the Depression. The adversarial nature of these policies showed that in times of crisis, international cooperation often dissolves, giving way to fierce economic competition. Moreover, the 1873 crisis led many nations to rethink their monetary and exchange rate policies. The gold standard, which dominated the most advanced economies, began to be questioned. The rigidity of the gold standard prevented countries from adjusting their monetary policies to meet their internal needs, which aggravated economic crises. Some countries began to consider the possibility of abandoning gold or adopting more flexible monetary systems. In the United States, the debate between supporters of the gold standard and advocates of using greenbacks, paper money not backed by gold, became more heated. This conflict over monetary policy illustrates one of the great economic dilemmas of the time: how to balance the need for monetary stability with the flexibility needed to confront crises. In international economic relations, this monetary uncertainty created a series of challenges. Countries that maintained the gold standard found themselves at a disadvantage when competing with nations that adopted more flexible monetary policies. This generated a series of diplomatic tensions, especially between the United States and the European powers, which still strictly adhered to the gold standard. The extraordinary impact of this monetary debate would be felt for decades, culminating in a series of reforms and adjustments to the international financial system that would shape the 20th century. Another important effect of the crisis was the increase in mass migration, particularly from European countries to the Americas. The economic depression drove many workers, especially in Europe, to seek better opportunities abroad. Argentina, for example, became one of the main destinations for European immigrants, offering land and work in exchange for skilled labor. Similarly, the United States continued to receive waves of immigrants who hoped to find new opportunities in a land that seemed less affected by the crisis. However, the reality that many of these migrants encountered upon arriving in these new countries often didn't match their expectations. Economic difficulties remained a constant, but curiosity for new opportunities and hope for a better future continued to drive the migration flow. This migration phenomenon helped shape the social and economic development of many countries in the Americas. International economic relations also began to redefine themselves with the emergence of new trade agreements and attempts at cooperation between nations. Despite the prevailing protectionism, there was a growing realization that economic cooperation would be essential for global recovery. This was a first step toward creating a more coordinated international trade system, which would be developed in the following decades. Although cooperative efforts were limited at the time, they planted the seeds for future institutions, such as the League of Nations and later the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank. The 1873 crisis, therefore, not only devastated national economies, but also redrew the map of global economic relations. International trade and monetary policy would never be the same. But the effects of this crisis weren't limited to the economic world. The next part of the story takes us to explore the social and cultural impact of this depression as it transformed mindsets and ways of life around the world. Ready to keep going on this fascinating journey? The social and cultural impact of the 1873 crisis. The 1873 crisis was not just an economic event. It had a profound impact on the social and cultural fabric of affected societies. The long depression that followed led to significant changes in people's behavior and mindset, particularly regarding work, the role of government, and trust in the future. The extraordinary psychological effect of the crisis was felt at all levels of society, from the financial elites to the working classes. Poverty and mass unemployment brought about a new kind of despair, and social tensions began to manifest in ways that would shape the future of politics and culture. In urban areas, where the crisis's impact was most acute, people began to question the economic and social system in which they lived. The vast disparity between the rich and the poor became more evident, fueling a sense of injustice and fostering revolutionary movements. The living conditions in cities, already precarious for many, worsened considerably with falling wages and rising evictions. The phenomenon of urban misery intensified, and many began to organize politically in search of change. A practical example was the growth of socialist and labor movements, which began to gain traction across Europe and the United States. These revolutionary ideas spread rapidly, promoting fierce criticism of the capitalist system. In popular culture, the crisis also brought a new vision of the future. The optimism that had characterized the pre-Depression era gave way to a sense of uncertainty and pessimism. The belief in endless progress, driven by the Industrial Revolution, began to be questioned. Writers, artists, and thinkers of the time began to explore themes of inequality, social crisis, and decline. Literature, in particular, was deeply influenced by this historical moment. Works by authors like Émile Zola, who explored the harsh realities of the working class, and Charles Dickens, who portrayed the struggles of poor families, reflected the harsh reality of the time. The curious thing is that, instead of celebrating progress and innovation, many artists and writers began to highlight the dangers of uncontrolled and unequal development. Additionally, the crisis deeply shook confidence in institutions. The government, once seen as a stabilizing force, came under criticism for its inability to protect the population from the devastating effects of the Depression. In the United States, for example, the government was widely criticized for its slow and ineffective response to the crisis. The issuance of greenbacks and attempts to stimulate the economy through monetary measures were seen as inadequate to deal with the magnitude of the problem. This generated a sense of alienation among citizens, especially among the lower classes, who felt abandoned by the political and economic elites. This phenomenon of distrust in authorities helped fuel the growth of populist and revolutionary movements. However, the social impact of the crisis also brought about some important innovations. Out of necessity, many families had to reorganize and adapt their lifestyles to survive. Women, in particular, began to play a more active role in the domestic economy, finding ways to supplement household income in times of hardship. This marked an extraordinary shift in the role of women in society, laying the groundwork for the feminist movements that would emerge in the following decades. By entering the workforce in greater numbers, women began to question traditional social norms and fight for more rights and equality. This period of crisis was, therefore, also a period of social and cultural transformation. Solidarity among the working classes also strengthened during the crisis. The organization of unions and the creation of workers' cooperatives were direct responses to the growing precariousness of labor and poor living conditions. Workers realized that only through unity could they push for significant changes. This social mobilization was one of the factors that led to the introduction of important labor and social reforms in the following decades, such as the regulation of working hours and the establishment of a minimum wage in some countries. The extraordinary strength of this popular movement is an example of how, although devastating, the crisis also served as a catalyst for lasting social change. Finally, the crisis altered the relationship between man and technology. If before, technological advancement was seen as something that would bring prosperity to all, the 1873 crisis revealed that innovation, when not accompanied by social responsibility, could generate inequality and suffering. This period marked the beginning of a deeper questioning of the role of technology and progress in society. The curious thing is that, at the same time that innovation continued, there was a growing demand for a more humane and sustainable development. This debate about balancing innovation and social well-being would continue to influence discussions about economics and culture throughout the 20th century. The 1873 crisis, therefore, left an indelible mark on the society and culture of its time. The psychological, political, and cultural impacts were as deep as the economic ones, transforming how people viewed the world around them. But there's still more to explore. In the next chapter, we'll dive into the lessons that the 1873 crisis left behind and how they continue to influence our understanding of economic crises today. Ready to move on? The lessons of the 1873 crisis and their relevance today. The crisis of 1873, despite being far in the past, offers valuable lessons that remain extraordinarily relevant in the modern world. One of the clearest teachings is the importance of caution during periods of rapid economic growth. Before the collapse, the world was immersed in excessive optimism, with overinvestment in the railroad and real estate sectors. The bubble created by rampant speculation was a reminder of the danger that human nature can pose to the economy, especially when driven by greed and an insatiable curiosity for quick returns. The lesson here is simple. Economic growth needs to be supported by solid foundations, not temporary illusions of wealth. Another crucial point learned from the 1873 crisis is the importance of financial regulation. At the time, markets operated with little oversight, and banks offered credit recklessly, especially for high-risk investments. This left the system vulnerable to shocks, such as the collapse of J. Cook and Company in the U.S. The crisis showed that the lack of control can lead to a devastating domino effect, where one bankruptcy triggers a wave of collapses. This phenomenon encouraged, in the following decades, the development of more robust regulations and the creation of financial institutions that could monitor and manage crises. Today, this is reflected in the importance of central banks and regulatory agencies that act as guardians of economic stability. The crisis also taught us about the dangers of economic protectionism. Many countries, in response to the Depression, adopted harsh protectionist policies, trying to shield their domestic industries from foreign competition. While these measures were well-intentioned, they ended up exacerbating the global crisis as international trade dropped drastically. This economic isolation showed that in an interconnected world, crisis solutions need to be cooperative and coordinated. Today, we see a direct lesson in this. In times of global crisis, such as the recent COVID-19 pandemic, international collaboration is essential for ensuring economic recovery. The extraordinary impact of protectionism in 1873 serves as a constant warning about the risks of isolationist policies. Another fundamental lesson is the issue of social inequality. The 1873 crisis exacerbated the divisions between rich and poor, leading to social tensions, strikes, and the growth of revolutionary movements. The lesson here is that economic crises often have an unequal impact on society, hitting the most vulnerable classes the hardest. The extraordinary growth of the labor movement and the demands for social reforms, which emerged as a response to the Depression, still reverberate in the modern world. Economic crises today, like the one in 2008, have shown that inequality can deepen during times of recession, making social protection and efforts to combat economic disparities a priority for ensuring long-term stability. A curious lesson the crisis left us is the value of trust in the financial system. The 1873 crisis was, in large part, a crisis of trust. Once investors lost faith in financial institutions, panic spread quickly. Trust is a fundamental pillar of any economy, and once broken, it is difficult to rebuild. Today, this lesson is particularly relevant. After the 2008 crisis, for example, we saw a global effort to restore confidence in the banking system through financial reforms, greater transparency, and safety measures to protect investors and consumers. The extraordinary power of trust in the financial market is something that remains unchanged. Finally, the 1873 crisis reminds us of human resilience in the face of economic adversity. Despite the devastation, society and the economy were able to adapt and eventually recover. Technological innovations continued to emerge, new forms of social organization developed, and the world emerged stronger and better prepared to deal with future crises. This phenomenon of adaptation and innovation in times of crisis is one of the greatest lessons history teaches us. Today, we live in a world where innovation, especially in areas such as technology and finance, continues to be a crucial response to economic difficulties. The extraordinary recovery after the 1873 crisis shows us that while crises are inevitable, they can also be moments of transformation and rebirth. The lessons left by the 1873 crisis are a constant reminder of how history can guide us in times of uncertainty. They show us that the balance between innovation, regulation, and social responsibility is essential to avoid the mistakes of the past. And so, we conclude this journey through the Long Depression, a period that, despite being painful, brought valuable lessons that still resonate today. Now, how have these learnings shaped your view of economic crises and the way the world responds to them? The 1873 crisis left powerful lessons that still echo in the modern world. But now, the question remains, are you ready to apply this knowledge to your own life? How can we avoid falling into the same traps of greed and overconfidence that caused this historic crisis? Reflecting on this can change the way you view finance and even how you see the future. And to continue exploring topics like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. After all, knowledge is the key to avoiding past mistakes and building a smarter, safer future.